Dialogs. We have a terrific presentation coming up, and of course you all know Jennifer Trahan, and Trahan, and so she needs very, very little introduction, but I would like to say just a couple things, in that Jennifer and New York University and the Center for Global Affairs has also been one of our most ardent supporters since the start of the dialogues, both financially, by giving us advice and helping us with programs, and in just so many ways. And I just want to again say thank you very much for everything that you've done over the years. And we just, like I say, it's because of you and because of the other sponsors that these dialogues are here for you today and yesterday and as we go into the future. And so thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for being here. I know it's early. I am so not a morning person, but I'm going to do my best. So, and thank you for that gracious introduction, Jim. It is a great pleasure to be here and to be a sponsor of this terrific dialogues. So I titled the program The Future of International Justice. So I should have titled it Views of the Future. I'm not actually trying to predict the future, but talk about different scenarios for the field. This is obviously a terrific field that is periodically under terrific stress, threat, pushback. Budget questions, I think, are leveled at all of the tribunals. So the question is, how does this field move forward in the most positive way? And I use something called scenarios prediction. So in political science, we sometimes talk about the future of a country, and this might be a government or a company trying to invest, and it would talk about different economic or political variables, and how would these potentially play out. So I was asking interviewees three kinds of questions. So the first was, assume this scenario. So my first scenario is the future of the field is predominantly the International Criminal Court. So we might have added hybrid tribunals, a couple. We might have domestic capacity, but really the ICC is our dominant institution. And what would this look like? Positive and negative. So what are some of the, can it be a stronger institution? And how would you foresee this? Well, are there negatives that we're not going that way? The ICC is not going to be the central dominant institution. And what are these that drive us away from that scenario? Then my second scenario was the international community keeps creating hybrid tribunals. We do have the ICC, we do have domestic capacity, but we continue with the proliferation of hybrids. And are we going to do this? Why? What are the benefits of this approach? What are the negatives of this approach? And for the sake of trying to, for a complete picture, I threw into here, do regional criminal tribunals have a role? And would we ever have another ad hoc tribunal? And in what kinds of circumstances? So my third scenario talked about domestic capacity. And rather than a proliferation of hybrids or the ICC as our central institution, we really shift capacity and we really start war crimes prosecution, not start. I know Uganda is here. There are various domestic efforts, but we really have a shift in the field. And then my question was not so much should we have this kind of shift, but are we getting there? Are we investing enough in capacity building and resources? And I asked people to assume a 20-year time trajectory. Are we really going to get there? Which is our dominant approach, and just playing this out. Again, not for the sake of predicting the future, but really going through the exercise and talking about our different variables. some said immediately, you can't talk the future of this field. It is so uncertain. There's so many different, politics at play, funding at play. So I had this was Binta Mansouri, who I had the privilege of interviewing, gave me immediate pushback. We just can't talk the future. There's too many variables. But I thought, well, let's try to identify some of these variables. I conducted the study in 2 parts, and I had the privilege of interviewing the prosecutors who were in Nuremberg, and some are here today, so I'm glad we have David Crane, Steve Rapp, Robert Petit, Nick Kumjans, and Bill Shabas as well. I interviewed in Nuremberg, as well as all the other prosecutors. Then I went to The Hague, so did 20 interviews in total. And then I conducted a workshop in New York at NYU on the same topic, and there I had more legal advisors from the UN missions. And they had a different perspective. And there, I think, for instance, we were talking a lot more, how do they explain to their states, like some of the benefits of tribunals that you can't quantify? How do they answer to the funders some of the difficult questions? So it's kind of a different perspective. And then Meg de Guzman and Milan Asterio joined that one, as well as David Crane and Stephen Rapp. I also engaged in this because in ICC circles, I see kind of this annual thinking of the legal advisors in particularly. They get assigned to work on complementarity or cooperation or universality for a 1-year period. And it seems to me they're immediately thinking, how do we improve the language that goes into the next ASP resolution on this? Either feed into the omnibus or a freestanding resolution. And they're thinking, how do we strengthen the language? And I'm like, no, you're missing the whole, if the court is going to be an effective institution, we have to go so much beyond how do we strengthen the language in the resolution. So, let's get out of this, this small annual thinking about these issues. And then one of the legal advisors said he was really happy to participate in this because he only works on ICC issues, and he said it was so interesting to talk about the system of international justice. And I'm thinking, well, of course, and probably most of you in the room get it, of course. But if the ICC is your only actor in a country, I think ultimately victims will be very disappointed to have a limited number of cases. So to me, the ICC's success also hinges on there being domestic prosecutions as well as being complementarity. So the ICC could meet all of its goals, and if there haven't been other actors at work, the cynicism may be invested on the ICC. So yes, we have to think about this as a system. And one of the neat things, I do really see this evolution in our thinking on complementarity that came out both in the interviews and in the New York workshop, was that I think we have a broader sense of complementarity. We were always thinking it's just domestic prosecutions. And a number of interviewees said, no, hybrids can be complementarity, a regional criminal tribunal. So I think this is fairly new. So that's interesting to see. We have to think about, I think it would require a Rome Statute amendment, because if you look at the language of Article 17, it pretty much sounds like it's thinking just domestic. So that's an exciting development. And I think that so many people are thinking added hybrids is also a development, because I think just post-Rome, people are saying, well, now we have a permanent court, we need nothing else. And I think we've evolved since that point and said, no, the ICC isn't going to be our only answer. So those were kind of 2 big picture takeaways. So I'm going to share some of the findings. I won't be capturing everybody's findings on everything, but I'll try to give you the predominant themes. So I started with, well, let me ask first, are there questions on my scenarios? And I should say, I asked everyone to assume that there's some universal jurisdiction prosecutions, and there's some transitional justice. So they have a seat at the table, and let's just assume they're with each of the scenarios. So those were kind of my questions to people. Any questions just on the scenarios? Okay, so I'll go into my findings. As I say, I'll just give a kind of an overview and of the predominant ones. I do have a report of the New York proceedings, and that's out on the NYU table, and I have a very large law review that's going to write up all these proceedings, and that will be forthcoming. So I started with, is the ICC going to be our central institution? And of course, I was interviewing Fatou Bensouda and James Stewart, so it would be surprising if we didn't have a resounding endorsement of the ICC, which of course we did. So one of the, and I'll read you just a few quotes so you have a flavor of the interviews. One of the quotes, for instance, from Richard Goldstone, explaining why he saw the ICC as our dominant institution of the future. He said, I really got very little doubt that we're going to continue with the ICC. I don't believe there's any practical alternative. If the ICC were to collapse, I think we'd be back to pre-1990 period where there would be complete impunity and there'd be no international criminal justice at all. That would be a tragedy for humankind. The reason I'm optimistic for the ICC is I don't think there's any real alternative. If there weren't an ICC, we'd be working on setting one up. So he, you know, a resounding endorsement, this is the way of the future. Fatou Bensouda gave me a similar quote. And then I asked, well, why? If scenario one is our way of the future, why is this the case? And many said, well, it's designed as our permanent institution. We designed it this way. The funding already lurked its head, and several said, well, we just don't think they're going to be ad hoc tribunals, certainly because of the cost. And then later, I did probe this a bit more. Some talked about the inefficiency of creating multiple tribunals each time, although we later have that approach endorsed. And the one judge I interviewed, Judge Ajus, said if we create multiple tribunals, we are fragmenting the law. And from a jurisprudence standpoint, this is problematic because what these tribunals, their judgments, they do not have to be using the same body of law. In fact, you know, we already see the ICC is not choosing to follow ICTY and ICTR. This wealth of jurisprudence, they look at it, they don't directly follow it. So we do have fragmentation. Hans Corell also raised that issue. A number of individuals said, well, even though you asked me to talk about scenario one, you can't talk about scenario one without scenario three. So a number immediately said these go together. Then I asked, well, is the ICC of the future in 20 years? And I also had pushed back on that. A couple of interviewees said, I think 20 years is too short a time frame in the trajectory of international law. Some of these developments, like switching into complementarity, might be 50 years, might be 30 years, so some also pushed back on the 20-year notion. When I asked, well, what is the ICC of the future going to look like? A number said it has to be a more efficient and effective institution. Hans Corell raised the need for more judges to have courtroom experience. He was very skeptical of the List B judges. Bill Shabas raised cost questions, for instance, about different aspects of the ICC. He raised great questions about the victim representation system. Sounds wonderful, giving victims a voice, but so many are just filling out forms, and then you have thousands of forms traveling to The Hague, and very few victims actually get to The Hague. Is this really giving victims a voice? And they're only mainly appearing through the common legal representative, who appears to be a second prosecutor, essentially. And how much is all this costing? So that was an interesting question. James Stewart went immediately on the defensive. That we're not too expensive. This international justice is an expensive endeavor. One of my favorite quotes, if you know James, you'll hear him saying this. He said, "Well, you're not making widgets," which I thought was cute. But he said, I think our responsibility is to use the resources we have in the most efficient and effective way. Since I've been at the court, from all of the, and I'm shortening a little, from all of the organs, the prosecutor, the registry, the president, the court, our buzzword is synergies. So we're working very hard to avoid duplication and make it much more efficient. So that was his response to some criticisms that were arising already on cost. And on I asked, is the ICC of the future going to be a much bigger institution? Like, is our ideal scenario we grow this institution? So I had a few say, yes, you need more courtrooms, more preliminary examinations, more investigations. But then I had the opposite, and they said, well, actually, ideally, we're switching away from the ICC. We're starting to deter crimes. We're switching to scenario 3, and we won't have the ICC. Now, nobody said, I think this is going to work in 20 years. But we did have, so Hassan Jallow stated, for instance, the picture which I see, which I hope will be what is there, is every country being a state party, with the ICC having very little work to do, and most of the work being done by national courts, regional and hybrid. And Hassan was one who firmly said, no, regional and hybrid are complements. They can be part of complementarity. So we had very divergent views, you know, what is optimal for the ICC? Should this be a growing institution? And this is, of course, funding willing, and, you know, funding has been a huge issue. So right now, I think, you know, massively growing the ICC is not even on the table among the donor countries. A number raised state cooperation. This has to be an institute. Right now, there are quite a number of outstanding arrest warrants. All the Darfur warrants have been outstanding for years, and many said, you know, this won't work if we don't have more state cooperation. And Judge Ejus raised the point that in the former Yugoslavia, they didn't get indictees turned over until there was the real leverage put on countries in the region to cooperate. So first the EU conditioned funding assistance, the US conditioned funding assistance, and then the EU conditioning accession talks. And he says he noted, obviously, the ICC doesn't have this kind of comparable leverage. And they didn't get arrests to happen until there was absolute consequences to non-arrest. So he threw out, and I think it's great food for thought, you know, how could the ICC create this kind of leverage? Because right now they have so many outstanding warrants, if this is the will of state parties, to really make this an effective institution. Others blamed the Security Council. Obviously, when the Security Council refers the situation, it should be doing the follow-up. This is not happening in either of the referred situations, and also the lack of Security Council funding came in. Increased ratifications. Everyone basically said, you know, a stronger, more effective ICC. We want, you know, much more membership. But of course, we all observe that the pace of ratifications has slowed. So, and last year threatened to move backwards by 3, and now is moving backwards by 1. So we all talk about universality, but is the court really moving towards universality? A lot observed this problem. I don't know that we had any great epiphanies, how, and it's particularly some of the larger countries, P5, the US here, you know, how will they really join this institution? A number said we just have to be an effective institution and show our credibility. I think my favorite quote here was by Robert Petit, who said, ultimately victims will be demanding their countries join the court. And he said, I think humanity as a whole, people always want justice. People want a fair treatment, a fair shot of having a better life, and certainly having their victimization recognized and accounted for. The push to bring some of those countries in line will have to come from their own population. I don't think the pressure to at least recognize that there has to be accountability, I don't think that pressure will let up. It's part of the political discourse now. If the ICC has done anything, it's certainly that, to make accountability a fact in any conflict. So I think there's a good chance eventually the outliers, as you call them, and I won't mention any names, will be brought into fold. So I like that the victims are going to demand their countries join the court. Fatou Bensouda said, stressed the importance of increasing ratifications to minimize the perception of double standards. I did talk about, would the ICC of the future have more crimes? Would the ICC of the future ideally have more crimes added? Do you really want to increase the subject matter jurisdiction? Among these interviewees, and the New York group, there wasn't a lot of interest in this. So the crime of aggression will come up at this Assembly of State Parties, so the fourth crime may be activated. And there is also a Belgian war crimes amendment endorsed by other states that may go up or may be put off because there's also judicial elections. So those are both in the immediate kind of offing. But beyond that, there wasn't a lot of endorsement. Of course, there are pending proposals. Drug trafficking, person trafficking come up. Terrorism had been on the table, put on by Netherlands, but then removed. And there's still another basket of war crimes amendments, and these are often not to add new war crimes, but just to harmonize the lists of those covered in international and non-international armed conflict. Mexico wants use of nuclear weapons to be a war crime. So there are other pending proposals and different directions one could go. Karsten Stahn talked about the future. We should be getting at the financial streams behind the crimes and the interconnectedness of transnational crime with the international crimes. So he hoped we'd be moving in that direction. A number said the ICC of the future won't have that much capacity. It will always just be our gold standard. It'll be our best, but we have to, for more capacity, always look elsewhere. I then had I asked those who seem skeptical about scenario one, well, what are the factors for your skepticism? If you don't see the ICC as our central institution, why is it? And a number brought up capacity. They said, well, it will be there, but it doesn't do that many cases. Cost, and particularly Syria was coming up in my interviews. And most participants said the ICC is ill-equipped to handle Syria. It doesn't do that many cases. David Schaffer said, yeah, but it would be good if the ICC could deal with the heavy lifting to handle Syria. But most talked about a hybrid as really being needed and serious capacity for dealing with the Syria situation someday when this becomes possible. The contra view, James Stewart said, well, actually we can do what we're funded to do. And if you want us to do 20 or more Syria cases, give us the money. If the ICC wants us to, we can expand. Many said, look, I think the world powers will remain outside the Rome Statute. I think David Crane was one of those. No, you're kidding yourselves when we talk about universality. We're not going to go there. And that is going to be ultimately a limiting factor for the ICC. There was a lot of talk about pushback. I'll just mention Kenya. I think most in the room know what I'm talking about. Prosecutor Bensouda said, well, yeah, we're becoming a more effective institution. We're going to hit this pushback. We shouldn't be surprised. James Stewart talked about the ICC harnessing the lessons learned from the Kenya situation. My most negative scenario was put on the table by David Crane. I did ask people, do I have the right scenarios? And David said, well, Jen, you could be talking about scenario 4, the ICC implodes, and scenario 5, the field of international justice. There's so much pushback by states, they just don't want us doing this. So once David had raised, I don't know if he bought into these or they're just possibilities, maybe. But once he had raised this, I did ask other interviewees, do you see us moving? And I got a resounding, and I was very happy, no, we're not moving. These are not conceivable pathways. Basically, we've come too far. The field is here to stay. And here, one of the stronger quotes on this, I think, was from Nick Kumjians. He said, I think the world has changed in the past 23, 24 years since the ICDY was set up. And what we see now, which is different than 2 or 3 decades ago, when there's a conflict like Syria and North Korea, even domestically, you immediately have people talking about international accountability. This wouldn't have happened 2 or 3 decades ago. So I think the field is here to stay. Victims in the conflicts I've handled in many different countries from different economic levels, different religions, the feeling of victims I find is quite universal. They want to see their suffering recognized and someone held to account for what happened. I think the field is here to stay. So that was kind of the predominant theme. So I'll take a little pause. I will go into scenarios 2 and 3. But do you have questions just about scenario 1? So this isn't just meant as a lecture. What came up? I see other negatives that, do you see things that I haven't? And we weren't trying to settle all these, but kind of put them on the table, the positive and negative factors. Anyone want to raise anything else at this point, or I'll keep talking? Okay, save it for the end, and maybe you'll think of questions by then. So my scenario 2 was we keep proliferating hybrid tribunals. We've had a number of hybrids, and by my count, there's someone from every single hybrid at Chautauqua here now. So we have people from Sierra Leone, Cambodia, East Timor, Kosovo, Bosnia. I think maybe, I don't know about the Hissan Habri trial. Yes, we did this last night. Sorry, I'm spacing out who it was, yes. So we have every hybrid represented, and the Lebanon Tribunal. We have a new Kosovo tribunal forming in The Hague. There is a CAR hybrid being created, and of course we hope there will be a hybrid for South Sudan. So Daryl Mundis, who I interviewed from STL, said, well, we keep talking about it's the end of all these specialized courts and tribunals, but we keep creating them. So this does seem the case that, there are more hybrids. Did you turn up the sound? Do we need to do that? I'm getting a lot of feedback. You can't hear me. Okay. All right. We'll go for it. So indeed, as I say, I think there's been a transformation. After the Rome Statute was enacted, everyone seemed complacent. Okay, we got the ICC. We don't need anything else. And then slowly reality crept in. Why would you need a hybrid? Well, sometimes our crimes are pre-2002. So ICC jurisdiction is not possible, and this would be, for instance, our new Kosovo tribunal. Sometimes your crimes are in a non-state party, so South Sudan is a Rome Statute non-state party. Or capacity, so CAR is a Rome Statute state party, but yet also developing a hybrid. So for those, I interviewed a number of the hybrid tribunal prosecutors, so I did get, of course, resounding endorsements that hybrid tribunals are a good way for the future, and I asked why. A lot talked about efficiency, but then in the negatives, I got inefficiency. So I'll come back to this. So some stress, they're very efficient, but ultimately we've seen they're costly as well. I'll go back to James. You're not making widgets. So cost, I think, is a difficulty that comes up for every single tribunal. Successful outreach. We, of course, see the Sierra Leone Special Court having been particularly successful, led by David Crane in his outreach efforts. And here is one of my other favorite quotes by David Crane, reminding us that accountability is not for the international community or for its own sake, but it's for the victims. So David said in his interview, "It's about the victims. How can we effectively account for them? Get justice for them?" And that's what we're missing. We're starting to miss the point. We don't create courts for accountability. Whatever that looks like, domestic courts, regional, international, the ICC, we have to ask ourselves, is this what needs to be done for the victims? And we may be surprised. You're talking to the victims, you're listening, you're investigating. You may be able to have a town hall, a dialogue. They need to understand what's going on, why it's going on this way. So I thought that was a beautiful reminder. We had some of the prosecutors talked about the benefits of being in their situation countries in terms of development of domestic capacity, but I think in our Sunday night panel on the ECCC, we saw some of the negatives of sitting in the situation country. This also came up in my interview of Serge Brammertz. When he was talking about, I may have pages out of order, sorry. When he was talking about investigating within Lebanon. So there are benefits of being more immediate in terms of people seeing your proceedings, interaction, domestic capacity building, but there are also negatives of being in the situation country. So that came out on both sides. Some said we are definitely have to have more hybrid tribunals. We just have too many atrocity crimes, and we don't have enough capacity. This was strongly endorsed by David Scheffer. He said, if you look at the world today, you have to conclude the worth and value of hybrid tribunals must be available. We have too many situations in the world which the International Criminal Court is not addressing and may not in the future. So we need more hybrids. Several brought up that hybrids are better at resisting political pressure than, for instance, purely a domestic institution, because they add neutrality and are seen to add neutrality and objectivity that the national judiciary may not have. This was endorsed, for instance, by Stephen Rapp and Nick Kumjians. But we have the negatives also of being closely working with the domestic judiciary. Nick Kumjian talked about the importance of demonstrating rule of law at work by your hybrids sitting in the situation countries, so this is one of the benefits. He stated, when a court tries cases about horrible crimes that happened in Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge or the horrible civil wars in Sierra Leone, that the fact those trials are going on in a transparent process and the evidence with the law applied, this raises expectations of people. The students, they come to watch, the ordinary people, the lawyers, the judges. I think it has a benefit of raising expectations. This kind of justice is possible. Cases can be decided not based on who has the most money or power, but based on the evidence and rule of law. I think this is a very subtle but very, very important benefit of international justice in these countries. So those were some of the benefits of hybrids. I then went into what is our best model hybrid, and I'll just cut to the chase. I won't go through all the views, but basically the view was, well, it depends on the situation. You're always working with the domestic judiciary. It's context specific. There is no one model hybrid necessarily. But I did get a resounding endorsement. There cannot be voluntary contributions, and we've already seen this raised at the dialogues this year. So Andrew Cayley has raised it here. Brenda Hollis strongly raised it. Daryl Mundis strongly raised it. So from the prosecutor's perspective, this is not the way to go about funding. For those who said no, scenario 2 is not our way of the future. It is, it's alternatives. We should not be creating more hybrids. Why is this? And here's where cost came up. And as I say, I don't think cost is particularly something that's leveled at the hybrids. It's leveled at the ICC. It was, of course, leveled at the ad hoc. So it is a pervasive critique by those who want to be critical. So here, and of course, if we do simplistic calculations, how many were prosecuted over the total cost of the tribunal? The results are not going to come out very well. So Brenda Hollis had a nice alternative that I really liked. She said, why don't we start measuring the number of victims' crimes covered in each case over the total cost of that case? So Brenda said, in terms of the number of people that were indicted, you can turn it around and say the number of crimes that were disposed of in these cases. You're talking tens of thousands of crimes which have accountability attached. So yeah, we had 13 people indicted, 10 went to trial, 9 to judgment. But these were individuals that, in our belief, based on the evidence we gathered, had the greatest responsibility for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of crimes. So if you talk about a case that determines accountability on that scale, all of a sudden, money becomes more relative. So I love that approach to talking about the numbers. And then a number talked about, some of this stuff isn't so capable of numeric calculation. And that's something I think, some people are missing. There's so many intangible benefits. And there's such a trend, at least among political scientists, if we can't prove through studies that a tribunal achieved this, well, then it didn't. So that's kind of the new trend. We're testing, and if we can't prove the ICD-wise impact, it didn't have impact in the region. And I think this is really problematic. First, I think some of these tests have been flawed, and we have to debunk some of this trend. There are other things that just can't be calculated. So Robert Petit talked about the value of rebuilding a society. Well, how would you quantify that? You can't quantify some of these benefits. Robert said, ask them if in their country they think justice is too expensive and should be done away with. There has to be accountability. Can it be done better or more cost effective? Of course, there can always be improvements. Anyone who has control over a budget should be accountable. That's a given. However, justice has its own price. It has a reward. It's not calculated in terms of money. Its impact is not a budget line. It's what it helps, how it helps society to rebuild. I don't think you can put a price on it, because that return is over many generations. Yet you're accountable. You should be careful with the money you're given. And a number of interviewees also talked about a potential peace dividend of tribunals. which yet is so hard to prove. So, you know, people are now saying, there's one study purporting to say ICDY yielded no peace dividend. I think it's a very flawed study, and it's very hard to tell because we don't know what the former Yugoslavia would look like had Karadzic or Mladic or Milosevic never been indicted or prosecuted. We simply don't know. Our sense is, well, of course, you know, taking these people out of power positions was helpful to the stability of the region, but we can't prove these things. Daryl Mundis, Serge Brammertz, Greg Townsend all brought this up. Peacekeeping is really expensive, and if you're minimizing any need for peacekeeping, then the tribunals are much cheaper, put to that light. Again, some of the negative factors of hybrids I've already mentioned, the difficulties of local ownership. Also the issue of victim dissatisfaction with high cost, slow speed, and limited number prosecuted. This came up when we were talking about hybrids. I think this would be brought up. Victims of ad hocs, victims of ICC would say this as well. And here was my most moving quote, I think, by Hans Corell. He said, "Here I never forget my meeting with the traditional chiefs in Sierra Leone, some 25 of them, a few were women. And they asked me, what can I tell my people? One of the chiefs rose in his dignified African way and asked the question, what can I tell my people when you come here with this court? It is judging only a few when we know among us there are so many who have committed these most heinous crimes. And I thought for a moment, what can I say as a white European to this African chief? And all of a sudden it came to me, I said, well, look at your own continent. Look at Nelson Mandela. What did he say when he came out of prison? Look at Kofi Annan. How did they act? So you now also have a parallel reconciliation commission. These will work in parallel. And that was the only way ahead, because even the best organized national criminal justice system would crumble if all these people would be brought to justice. And I saw in my eyes, when I saw in my armored car to go to the negotiations, there were children coming showing no hands. A little boy was sitting on a four-wheeled thing, pushing himself forward as if it was on skis. His legs had been chopped off. And these were crimes committed by other young people who had been drugged and taught by grown-ups. So clearly there are limitations to even hybrid tribunals, we have to be aware. I thought he had a wonderfully eloquent way of putting it. So then I asked my interviewees, and I'm going to skip scenario 3 so that we can have a little questions, or I'll give a real short synopsis. So I'll just say, to quickly start working on wrapping up, I did ask, is there a future for regional criminal tribunals? And a couple of endorsed, I didn't get to this question in everyone's interviews, but a couple gave a resounding endorsement. And then with Hassan, I raised, well, look at the Malabo Protocol, which would add a criminal jurisdiction to the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. And I said, but it has this huge immunity provision for state actors. You know, how can that work in complement to the ICC? And he said, that has to go for that to be an effective court. So I thought that was good. So there definitely, people did see regional criminal chambers as having potential. I do think Malabo may not be the model because it has this huge immunity provision. I asked about, is there a future for ad hocs? And of course, I sound delusional almost in asking this question because, you know, the funders say, no, we're never doing that. They're too expensive. We're absolutely never, ever doing this again. So I'm definitely, you know, pushing against the cross current in this. And then I go to like a serious situation and I say, well, aren't you going to need serious capacity? I mean, ICDY indicted 161. So it is our tribunal with the greatest amount of capacity. If you're ever doing serious crimes, and a lot of ifs, that we have a political environment that allows the creation of this tribunal some way, somehow, isn't it going to have to be the size of the ICDY, for instance? And push this way. A few did endorse this. I mean, most said, no, no, we've been told. And these were particularly, you know, a juice is like, oh, I've been told, no, we will never do this again. You know, so they've been beaten down by the funders. But, you know, some did say, yeah, if you're really doing accountability for Syria, you need serious capacity. And yes, you're right, that is our biggest institution. And as I say, and our most optimistic voice, I just want to say, on Syria was David Sheffer, who said we could be creating a tribunal now. Look at the GA. It just created the IIIM. So the GA, when it's frustrated enough, can act, and it could work with countries in the region to create a regional hybrid, and we could start this process now. So he was my most optimistic in Syria. I'm going to do like 2 sentences on scenario 3 because I can't really summarize the findings. I had endorsement of the benefits of domestic capacity. Joseph Kamara, who I got to interview, was talking about some of the benefits. We had skeptics. Brenda Hollis said, you will never do the really high-level cases at the domestic level. And I have a great quote on Brenda, but she was skeptical. She said there are limits to how much you're going to shift to your scenario 3. David Sheffer talked about the difficulty prosecuting one's own atrocity crimes. We kind of all get what he's talking about. And then I pushed on, are we doing enough in to create domestic capacity? Because this is done very ad hoc. There are countries that are at work on rule of law development, not always particularly atrocity crimes, rule of law. There's, justice rapid response. The ICC, does some matching of donors and capacity. I mean, it's all very, I know ICDY went to, worked with the Uganda chamber, but it's all a bit ad hoc. So I was pushing, should this be centrally coordinated? So some said, yes, it should be centrally coordinated. Others said, no, you're dreaming, this will never happen. States don't want to be told how to micromanage their judiciaries. They don't want this. And from the donor side, one of the states said, no, we want to control our donor funding. We don't want to give it to a pool. We want to decide who we're funding on what. So pushback on this. For those who thought it should be coordinated, I said, should the ICC develop some great, capacity building capacity to at least centrally coordinate some of this and do capacity building. My ICC interviewee said, well, that might be nice, but the ASP has not given us the money, they've not given us the mandate, so we're told no, we're not really supposed to be doing that much capacity building. I said, well, should it be the ICC? People applied, well, if the ICC is at work in situation countries, it would be logical. Others said, please don't create a competitor to the ICC. So this was all kind of left up in midair. There was some interest, we're not doing enough globally on making sure there's capacity, particularly genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or core atrocity crimes. But a way forward, I didn't see kind of a harmonious approach emerging. And then finally, at the end, I said, do you want to go out of, these scenarios? And I did say, could you endorse scenario 1, 2, or 3? And a number of interviewees said, but I think the future is all 3. And I like that, and I do actually think that is the case, that the ICC will be at work, we will have hybrids, we'll have domestic capacity, and it will be a combined approach. So I'm going to conclude here and just say, this is a remarkable field, but I think it's helpful to step back and say, how do we maintain this positive momentum? How can we strengthen against political pushback, against attacks on the courts, the potential elephant in the room of, the funding question that the states are always raising, and how can we better respond to that? What lessons can we learn from this? So these were some of the ideas I was trying to probe, get my interviewees to probe, get the states parties to probe, and maybe you will think about this further and you can get my report and ponder this further. I'm going to stop and